Beneath your feet lies a hidden world that once decided human destiny. The disappearance of ancient canyons is one of history's greatest untold stories, a geological mystery that forced our ancestors to innovate or perish. You will learn how the loss of these colossal landscapes sparked the very inventions that built civilization, from farming to social cooperation. Why would the fading of a canyon push humans to domesticate plants, and what forgotten survival strategies emerged from that emptiness? How does the ghost of a riverbed still influence the world we live in today? What does it truly mean to build a future from the ruins of a lost world? Millions of years ago, the Earth was a master sculptor, its tools the immense power of shifting continents and torrents of water. Tectonic plates groaned and collided, lifting vast highlands into the sky, while colossal rivers, fed by relentless rains, began their patient work of carving through the soft rock. They did not gently etch the land, they tore into it, grinding out deep, winding canyons over epochs. These were not just cracks in the ground, they were entire worlds unto themselves, vertical landscapes of staggering scale. Their cliffs offered protected alcoves for shelter from the elements and predators. Their floors, enriched by seasonal floods, became ribbons of unbelievable fertility, supporting a dense tapestry of plants and animals. For our early ancestors, these canyons were more than just home. They were the very arteries of the continent. They provided predictable routes for seasonal migration, guiding bands of humans as they followed game and ripening fruit. The constant presence of fresh water and abundant stone for tools created perfect hubs for experimentation and growth. It was within these sheltered, resource-rich corridors that the first sparks of complex social structures and technologies were nurtured. The canyon was not just a place to live, it was a partner in survival, a stable foundation upon which early humanity could slowly build its knowledge. To lose such a partner would be to lose the world itself, a catastrophe that would demand nothing less than a complete reinvention of what it means to be human. The stability of that world was an illusion. These canyons, which seemed like permanent features of the Earth, began a slow, inexorable retreat. What could possibly erase such monumental landscapes? The answer lies in a quiet war waged by the planet itself, a battle of colossal forces working in concert. The first great change was a shift in the sky. As the last great ice age waned, global weather patterns transformed. The relentless rains that once fed the canyon-carving rivers grew sporadic, replaced by longer dry seasons. The rivers themselves, the very lifelines of these chasms, began to shrink. Their flows weakened, no longer powerful enough to scour and carry away rock and debris. Instead, they became lazy, depositing their loads of silt and sand, slowly choking the deep channels they had once created. This was not a violent end, but a slow suffocation by sediment, filling the great depths from the bottom up. At the same time, the very ground beneath them was in motion. Tectonic forces, the same ones that had lifted the highlands, continued their patient work, sometimes raising the land and tilting river courses, diverting water away from its ancient path. Meanwhile, the unceasing work of wind and water erosion sanded down the once jagged cliff faces, rounding sharp edges and softening the dramatic profiles of the canyons. This transformation did not occur over centuries, but across tens of thousands of years, a gradual fading from a deep, dramatic gorge to a shallow, buried valley, and finally, to a gentle, almost imperceptible roll in the land. For the human communities watching their world soften and fade, this was a crisis in slow motion. Generation after generation would notice the springs drying up, the game becoming scarcer, the protective cliffs crumbling into gentle slopes. The very foundation of their survival was literally being filled in and washed away. This planetary flux created a pressing ultimatum, a challenge that could not be ignored. Adapt to this new, open world or face being erased along with the canyons. The slow fading of their canyon home was not an immediate crisis, but a creeping tide of scarcity. Generations watched the once reliable world turn fickle. The choice became unavoidable: stay and dwindle, or leave and dare. These vanished chasms became a powerful push, a force of expulsion that sent small bands of humans walking away from everything they knew. Their migration was not a blind wandering. It was a deliberate, desperate search for a new anchor, a landscape that could offer what their old home no longer did. When a great canyon system silted up, its rich hunting grounds and sheltered routes disappeared. This forced communities out into the open savannas, a vast and exposed world that demanded new eyes, new strategies for tracking game across endless grass. Others, driven by the same loss, found their way to coastlines, learning to harvest the ocean's bounty, a skill their inland ancestors never needed. This movement was a grand, unplanned experiment in human resilience. As these groups spread across continents, they encountered other bands on similar journeys, leading to meetings, exchanges, and unions. The genetic tapestry of humanity today, our incredible diversity, was woven in part by these ancient farewells to lost worlds. The trails they blazed are not just marked by stone tools and hearth ashes. They are written in our very blood, a permanent record of how profound loss can ignite an era of unprecedented exploration. This great scattering, born from emptiness, forced a revolution in the human playbook for survival. But the open savannas and unfamiliar coastlines offered no easy life. Survival in these new frontiers demanded a new kind of intelligence, one expressed not just in movement, but in the very stones people carried. The first great innovation sparked by this exile was a revolution in their hands, a transformation of simple tools into sophisticated technology. Gone were the dependable canyon quarries, the rich seams of high-quality flint that could be predictably shaped into reliable blades. Forced to make do with whatever materials their new homes provided, these pioneers began to experiment. They turned to bone, carving it into sharp, barbed points for fishing and hunting. They mastered wood, fashioning it into durable spear shafts and digging sticks. They sought out volcanic glass, obsidian, learning to flake its razor-sharp edges into lethal projectile points. This was not mere tinkering. It was a cognitive leap, a shift from simply using what was readily available to actively seeking out and mastering novel resources. The archaeological record from this period reveals this explosion of ingenuity. We find not the crude, multi-purpose hand axes of a previous era, but an array of specialized instruments. Exquisitely crafted spear points, designed to fly true and inflict a killing wound. Delicate scraping tools, engineered to clean hides with precision or shape a piece of wood into a perfect handle. Each tool was a solution to a specific problem presented by a new world. This specialization did more than just make hunting and food preparation more efficient. It forged new bonds of social cooperation. The most skilled flint knapper could now provide deadly weapons for the hunters, while another crafted the scrapers needed by those preparing the catch. Tool making evolved from a universal skill into a specialized craft, creating a web of interdependence that strengthened the entire community. In the face of losing everything, humanity did not just find new things, they learned to make them, and in doing so, they remade themselves. Yet this new world of tools created its own challenge, a demand for a different kind of strength. A single person, no matter how skilled with a spear, could not survive for long in an open landscape where danger and scarcity were constant. The second great survival strategy was born not from a single hand, but from many hands joining together. As the canyon's resources dwindled, the old ways of small, independent family bands began to fracture under the strain. The solution was a revolution in human connection, the dawn of complex social cooperation. Groups that had once roamed and foraged on their own began to coalesce into larger, more organized communities. They realized that survival was a collective effort. Hunting large game on the vast savanna was not a solo pursuit. It required coordinated groups to track, encircle, and bring down prey. Gathering enough wild grains to sustain a group through a dry season meant working together to harvest and process the food efficiently. Even the vital task of raising children became a shared responsibility, freeing others to contribute to the community's well-being. This was the birth of the division of labor. For the first time, an individual could specialize. The most patient and observant person could become the group's primary toolmaker, perfecting their craft while others provided food. Someone with a deep understanding of animal behavior could lead the hunts. Another, with a talent for resolving disputes or inspiring others, could step into a role of leadership. Perhaps even a person who seemed to understand the unseen patterns of the world, the cycles of the moon and the seasons, could provide spiritual guidance, offering comfort and meaning in a time of great uncertainty. This specialization created a powerful web of interdependence. Everyone's survival was now tied to everyone else's success. We see the magnificent results of this new social order at ancient sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Here, thousands of years before the pyramids, hunter-gatherers came together to erect massive stone pillars carved with intricate animals. This was not a village, but a ceremonial center, a project that would have required feeding and organizing hundreds of people who were not focused on their own immediate survival. What could possibly motivate such a colossal communal effort? Many archaeologists believe it was a response to environmental stress, a way to forge a shared identity and a common purpose in the face of a changing world. By building something permanent together, they were building a new kind of society, one strong enough to manage scarce resources and mitigate the conflicts that scarcity inevitably brings. This profound shift proved that unity can be the most powerful weapon against emptiness. Cooperation became the unshakable cornerstone of human resilience, a testament to the fact that our greatest strength has always been each other. The very ground beneath their feet was rewriting the rules of survival. With the great canyon slowly fading into gentle hills, the protective alcoves and sheer cliffs that had sheltered generations were gone. This new, exposed world offered no natural refuge from prowling predators or the biting wind. The third great adaptation was born from this profound vulnerability, a complete reinvention of the concept of home. People could no longer simply find shelter, they had to build it from scratch. They turned to the materials their new environments provided, mixing mud and straw to form sturdy bricks that baked hard in the sun. They gathered river stones, stacking them with patience to create walls that could withstand the seasons. They learned to fell trees and shape timber into frames for sturdy roofs. These were not temporary huts but durable dwellings designed to last, and they often chose to build in elevated areas on hills or plateaus where they could see danger approaching from miles away. This was a defensive calculation, a way to manufacture the security the lost canyons had once provided for free. These new settlements were planned with a foresight never before seen. Archaeologists find the remains of ancient villages laid out with clear intention, featuring dedicated storage pits for surplus food and open communal spaces for gatherings and work. This shift from temporary camps to permanent villages marks a fundamental change in the human story. It was the dawn of a sedentary lifestyle. For the first time, people were putting down deep roots. A permanent home allowed for the accumulation of possessions, things that were too heavy or cumbersome to carry on a nomadic journey. This, in turn, gave rise to new ideas about ownership and property. What did it mean to own a house, a plot of land, a stored harvest? These questions would eventually reshape human society. The evolution of shelter was more than just a technical solution. It was a profound psychological shift. Humanity was no longer just passing through the landscape. It was beginning to imprint itself upon it, turning a moment of environmental loss into the very foundation of the first true villages and towns. But a permanent home created a new kind of problem, a gnawing hunger that the old ways could no longer satisfy. With the rich, diverse ecosystems of the canyons gone, the daily hunt for food became a desperate gamble. The wild grains that once grew in abundance along the sheltered valley floors were now scattered and unreliable. Game animals grew wary and scarce on the open plains. The fourth great survival strategy was born from this constant pressure, a quiet revolution that would change everything. Humanity began to move from simply finding food to consciously creating it. This was the dawn of agriculture. It did not happen in a single season or even a single lifetime. It was a slow, collective realization, born of observation and necessity. People noticed that the seeds they discarded near their new, permanent settlements would sometimes sprout into new plants. They began to experiment, deliberately saving the best seeds from the hardiest wild wheat and barley plants and scattering them in cleared patches of earth. They learned to tend the soil, to weed, and to protect these nascent gardens. This was a monumental cognitive leap. It required planning for a harvest that was months away, a level of foresight that hunter-gatherers living hand-to-mouth rarely needed. The rewards of this patience were transformative. For the first time, human communities could produce a food surplus. A single family working a small plot of land could grow more grain than they could eat before it spoiled. This surplus changed the very fabric of existence. It meant that not everyone had to spend every waking moment in search of the next meal. This abundance, stored in granaries and clay pots, acted as a buffer against lean years and harsh seasons, reducing the daily uncertainty that had plagued human life for millennia. With a reliable food source secured, populations could grow and villages could expand. The domestication of animals soon followed this agricultural revolution. Wild goats and sheep, which had once been elusive prey, were gradually brought under human control. They provided a walking larder, a steady supply of meat, milk, and wool without the constant risk and effort of the hunt. These animals also became a source of labor, their strength used to pull plows and carry burdens. This shift from foraging to farming did not just fill stomachs, it rewired society. The ability to produce surplus food created the world's first economies. A potter could trade their wares for a farmer's grain. A toolmaker could exchange a new axe for a shepherd's wool. This specialization, powered by the agricultural surplus, led to the accumulation of wealth and the emergence of social hierarchies. Someone had to manage the communal grain stores, to organize the planting schedules, and to settle disputes over land and water rights. From this need, the first forms of structured governance were born. The decision to plant a seed was an answer to the emptiness left by the vanished canyons, a declaration that humanity would no longer be a passive victim of its environment, but an active force shaping its own destiny. A permanent home and a steady food supply solved one problem but created another, a new kind of emptiness. The rich, localized resources of the ancient canyons were gone forever. No single village, no matter how well farmed, had everything it needed. The fifth great strategy for survival was to reach out, to turn isolation into connection through the birth of trade. When a community sat on a rich deposit of obsidian, that volcanic glass that made the sharpest blades, they had a treasure, but not one you could eat. Another village, skilled in weaving, might have sturdy baskets but lack good stone for their tools. The solution was a simple, revolutionary idea: to exchange what you had for what you needed. This was the spark that ignited the first economic networks. Obsidian from distant volcanoes has been found hundreds of miles from its source, nestled in villages that had no access to the material themselves. Seashells from warm coasts turned up deep in the interiors of continents, prized as ornaments and symbols of status. These were not random gifts, but the evidence of established trade routes, pathways that connected people who would never have met in the world of the vanished canyons. These routes became more than just lines on a map. They were the arteries of a new collective body. Along these paths traveled more than just goods. A new way to have to spear, a design for a better pot, a story about the stars, even words from a foreign tongue. All these ideas hitched a ride with the traders. Innovation was no longer a local secret. It became a contagious force, spreading from group to group and accelerating the pace of cultural change. To manage this new flow of goods, people developed systems of value. A barter system emerged where a certain measure of grain might be worth a fine obsidian blade, or a clay pot could be traded for a bundle of rare feathers. In some places, this evolved further into primitive currencies, like standardized beads or rings of metal, objects that held agreed upon value beyond their physical form. This was a mental leap as profound as planting the first seed. It allowed for the accumulation of abstract wealth and cemented the specialization of crafts. A potter could now focus entirely on their art, confident they could trade their pots for all the food and tools they required. This economic interdependence wove a powerful safety net. A drought might strike one region, but through trade they could acquire food from a more fortunate area. A scarcity in one place became an opportunity in another. The loss of the canyon's self-sufficiency forced humanity to build a different kind of security, one based not on what a single landscape could provide, but on the strength of the bonds between them. This awakening to a wider world born from need laid the foundation for every market, every shipping lane, and every global connection that would follow. This profound shift in how people lived and traded demanded a parallel shift in how they understood the world. The steady, predictable rhythms of the canyon were gone, replaced by a landscape that seemed to shift and change with a mind of its own. This environmental loss triggered a deep cultural metamorphosis, reshaping the very foundations of human belief and artistic expression. People began to ask new kinds of questions. Why had the great waters receded? What power had smoothed the mighty cliffs? The answers were not found in ledgers of trade, but in the realm of myth and symbol. On the walls of caves and the faces of rock shelters, they began to paint and carve a new vision of the world. These were not simple portraits of animals. They were landscapes in transition, swirling symbols of water and earth, and haunting depictions of journeys through unfamiliar terrain. A spiral might represent a lost whirlpool, a series of wavy lines a memory of the mighty river. These artistic expressions were a form of processing profound change, a way to make sense of a world that had become unpredictable. They reflected a growing reverence for the immense, often terrifying power of nature, and a desperate desire to understand its mysteries. Alongside this visual record, a new tradition was born in the spoken word. Around communal fires, elders likely began to weave stories, the first oral traditions. They told tales of a great flood sent by a powerful spirit, or of an earth-shaking giant who had reshaped the land. These myths were not primitive science, they were profound psychology. They provided a framework for understanding the trauma of loss, offering comfort and meaning in a time of deep uncertainty. By giving a name and a story to the forces that had erased their old world, people gained a small measure of control over the chaos. This cultural output was far more than decoration. A cave painting showing the migration path of animals was a survival map. A story about a trickster stealing the water explained a drought and reinforced the importance of conserving resources. Art and belief became essential tools for navigating a transformed world, strengthening group cohesion by providing a shared identity and a common history. They embedded resilience into the human psyche, teaching each new generation that even when the world changes beyond recognition, the human spirit can find a way to endure, to create, and to find new meaning. This deep, unbreakable link between a changing environment and the culture it inspires is a legacy written not in stone, but in the stories we tell and the art we create. The planet's climate has never been a steady drumbeat, but a wild, unpredictable rhythm of ice ages and warm periods. These oscillations did not just change the temperature, they supercharged the very forces that dismantled the Great Canyons. During warmer, wetter phases, melting glaciers sent colossal pulses of water and sediment raging down river systems. These weren't gentle streams, but liquid bulldozers, hauling unimaginable amounts of sand, silt, and gravel straight into the heart of the canyons, choking them from the bottom up. Then a shift would occur. A drier, cooler period would settle in, and the same rivers would shrink to a trickle, leaving the newly deposited sediment to bake in the sun, slowly transforming a deep watercourse into a broad, fertile plain. For the humans living through this, it was like the ground was constantly shifting beneath their feet. The rules of survival were rewritten with every generation. One century, a community might thrive on the rich game drawn to the lush, sediment-filled valley. A few generations later, that same valley could become a dry, wind-swept basin, forcing them to move or starve. This wasn't a single catastrophe, but a relentless cycle of boom and bust, a planetary pulse that demanded an equally dynamic response from its inhabitants. To survive, people had to become masters of pattern recognition. They learned to read the subtle signs in the environment, tracking the migrations of animals that themselves were fleeing changing conditions. They developed complex seasonal migration patterns, moving between the highlands and lowlands to exploit resources as they became available throughout the year. When one food source failed, they couldn't afford to be picky. This pressure forced a dramatic diversification of their diet. They learned to grind tough, wild grains into flour, to dig for starchy roots, and to exploit every possible source of nutrition from insects to shellfish. This incredible flexibility, born from necessity, is etched into the trash heaps they left behind, where archaeologists find the bones of dozens of different animal species and the remains of a vast array of plants. The evidence for this intimate dance between climate and culture is locked away in natural archives. Ice cores drilled from ancient glaciers contain tiny bubbles of the Earth's ancient atmosphere, revealing precise timelines of temperature and greenhouse gas changes. Sediment layers from lake beds and ocean floors act like a history book, with each stratum holding pollen, charcoal, and fossils that tell us what the landscape was like in a given era. When we lay this climatic data alongside the archaeological record, a stunning pattern emerges. Major cultural leaps, like the widespread adoption of agriculture, often coincide directly with periods of significant climate fluctuation. It seems that when the old, predictable world crumbled, humanity was pushed to invent a new one. This long view offers a profound lesson. Our species has always lived on a planet of change. The challenge has never been to stop the climate from changing, but to harness our collective ingenuity to adapt to it. The story of the lost canyons is a testament to that deep-seated resilience, a reminder that our greatest evolutionary advantage has always been our ability to learn, to cooperate, and to change ourselves in the face of a changing world. The story of the vanished canyons is written in the sand of the world's greatest desert. The Sahara was not always a sea of dunes. Just a few thousand years ago, it was a green and vibrant land, crisscrossed by deep river canyons that pulsed with seasonal floods. These waterways carved life into the rock, supporting lush corridors of acacia trees and grasslands where hippos wallowed and giraffes browsed. Human communities thrived along these aquatic highways, hunting, fishing, and gathering in a world that seems almost unimaginable today. They left their story on the stone, painting and carving images of the life they knew, a gallery of a lost paradise, but the planet's rhythms shifted once more. The rains that fed the canyon rivers grew sparse, and the mighty flows began to weaken. The rivers, no longer strong enough to carve, became lazy, depositing their loads of silt and sand. Slowly, relentlessly, the canyons filled in, their deep channels smothered by sediment. The protective cliffs crumbled, and the lush vegetation withered under a relentless sun. The green Sahara began to die, transforming into the vast desert we know today. For the people who had called it home, this was an unending emergency. The very arteries of their world were hardening, forcing a monumental decision. They watched their world turn to dust and began the long, desperate walk to find water. This great exodus, born from the silencing of the canyons, channeled a wave of human knowledge and innovation toward the one permanent river that could sustain them, the Nile. These environmental refugees did not arrive empty-handed. They brought with them the hard-won knowledge of their ancestral struggle. They understood seasonal flooding from their lost canyon rivers. They brought early techniques for cultivating wild grains, techniques forged in the desperation of a drying world. They carried with them the social structures of cooperation that had allowed them to survive in a challenging land. This influx of people and their accumulated wisdom poured into the Nile Valley, supercharging the existing cultures. The need to manage the Nile's annual flood for the benefit of a much larger, denser population demanded unprecedented levels of social organization. The simple cooperation of village life had to scale up into the complex, centralized administration of a state. Out of the desolation of the lost Sahara, the seeds of pharaonic Egypt were sown. The rock art left behind in the desert stands as a haunting memorial. Those paintings of hippos and giraffes are not just depictions of animals, they are a testament to a world that was, a poignant reminder of how quickly a landscape can change and how profoundly that change can redirect the course of human history. The disappearance of the Sahara's canyons did not just erase a world, it helped create one of humanity's most enduring civilizations, proving that from the deepest loss can spring the most magnificent new beginnings. Even the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers were not immune to the slow, planetary shifts that reshaped the world. Their powerful currents, which had once carved deep gorges through the Mesopotamian plain, began to weaken, burdened by immense loads of silt eroded from distant mountains. The rivers that had been the region's lifelines started to behave unpredictably. Their channels silted up, creating marshy, unreliable waterways that flooded violently in the spring and shriveled to a trickle in the summer heat. For the communities relying on these waters, this was a crisis of timing and distribution. The life-giving floods no longer arrived when the crops needed them most, and vast areas of fertile land were left parched just steps from the overflowing riverbanks. This environmental paradox, a land of fertile soil dying of thirst, forced a monumental decision. The people of Mesopotamia could not command the rivers to flow as they once did. so they embarked on an even more audacious plan. They would build new rivers themselves. This was the genesis of large-scale irrigation, a technological leap born from absolute necessity. Using simple tools of wood and stone, these early engineers began to reshape the very landscape. They dug vast networks of canals, arteries of water that branched out from the main rivers to carry life to the waiting fields. They constructed strong earthen dikes to contain the destructive spring floods, and they built clever sluice gates to control the flow into their artificial channels. This was not just digging ditches, it was the birth of hydraulic engineering. It required a deep understanding of gravity and slope, of how to make water flow gently and evenly across miles of flat plain. The reward for this colossal effort was an agricultural productivity unlike anything the world had seen before. With a reliable, managed water supply, farmers could plant larger fields and be confident of a harvest. They could grow surplus crops year after year, transforming the precarious gamble of farming into a stable, predictable foundation for society. This agricultural explosion did more than just fill granaries, it built the world's first cities. Settlements like Uruk and swelled in size, their populations sustained by the bounty of the irrigated fields. For the first time in history, thousands of people lived together in a single, densely packed urban center. But this new scale of human organization created its own set of profound challenges. How do you manage the fair distribution of water to thousands of farmers? How do you resolve disputes over land boundaries now that every square foot of irrigated soil was incredibly valuable? How do you keep records of the massive grain surpluses stored in the city's temples? The old ways of oral agreements and communal memory were no longer sufficient. The pressure of managing this man-made landscape sparked a cascade of innovations that would define civilization itself. To track the complex flow of goods and labor, they invented writing, etching the first cuneiform symbols into clay tablets. To administer justice and maintain order in the crowded city, they developed the first legal codes. To organize the thousands of workers needed to maintain the canals, they created the first structured bureaucracies. The silenced gorges of Mesopotamia, by forcing humanity to control water, inadvertently taught them how to control complexity itself. The legacy of those first engineers is all around us, in every canal that waters a modern farm, and in every system of laws that governs a modern city, a permanent reminder that our greatest structures often rise from the bedrock of our greatest constraints. Across the plains of ancient North America, the same quiet disaster was unfolding. The great canyons and valleys that once channeled meltwater from the retreating ice sheets began to soften and vanish, their deep profiles erased by a blanket of silt and gravel. This was more than a change of scenery, it was the collapse of an entire world. These sheltered valleys had been unique biological refuges, microclimates where lush vegetation thrived, supporting an incredible array of massive creatures. Mammoths with tusks like curved tree trunks, giant ground sloths that stood taller than a house, and saber-toothed cats with fangs like daggers all depended on these fertile corridors. When the valleys filled in, the ecological heart of the continent skipped a beat. The rich grasslands that fed the megafauna shrank and fragmented, and the protective shelter of the deep topography was gone, leaving the great beasts exposed and vulnerable. For the Clovis people, master hunters who had perfected the spear point to bring down these titans, the world was literally shrinking. Their premier food source was disappearing before their eyes. The archaeological record tells a stark story. The elegant, fluted Clovis points, once used to hunt mammoth, are found less and less. Then they vanish entirely, replaced by a new toolkit designed for a new, smaller reality. This was not a choice but an imperative. With the giant mammals gone, every aspect of daily life had to be reinvented. hunting was no longer about a single, coordinated strike on a mammoth. It became a constant, careful pursuit of deer, rabbit, and bison, prey that was faster, more numerous, and required different tactics. This shift demanded more sophisticated tools, not just deadly spear points, but a whole array of specialized gear. We see the emergence of the atlatl, a spear thrower that gave hunters incredible leverage and distance, turning a human arm into a more powerful weapon to take down swift game. We find evidence of nets woven from plant fibers for snaring small animals and birds, and an explosion of grinding stones used to process the seeds, nuts, and roots that now formed a much larger part of the diet. This new way of life placed a premium on knowledge and cooperation. Tracking a herd of deer required a deep, intimate understanding of animal behavior. Gathering enough plant food to sustain a group meant knowing exactly when and where each type of nut would ripen or which root was edible. This intricate knowledge of the local environment became the most valuable currency for survival. The loss of the giant beasts was not just a physical blow, it was a profound spiritual and psychological rupture. These animals had been more than just food. They were powerful forces, embodiments of the land's abundance and mystery. We see evidence of this in the careful, ritualistic burial of a mammoth skull, or in the cave paintings that honor the great sloth, not as a simple prey animal, but as a revered spirit. These acts suggest a deep desire to appease the ghosts of the vanished giants, to seek forgiveness for their role in the extinction, or simply to remember the world they had lost. This connection between a changing landscape and the human soul reveals a timeless truth. When a species disappears, it takes more than just a source of food with it. It takes a piece of our understanding of the world, leaving a void that we strive to fill with memory, art, and belief. The story of North America's lost valleys is a powerful lesson in cascading consequences, where the silencing of a canyon can echo through an ecosystem, topple giants, and ultimately force humanity to find a new way to belong to the land. That profound sense of loss, the slow-motion collapse of a world they had always known, carved something new into the human mind. It forged a deep psychological shift, a move from living purely in the present to actively planning for a precarious future. This was the birth of foresight, a cognitive muscle strengthened by necessity. When the canyons faded, taking with them the predictable rhythms of water and game, people could no longer assume tomorrow would simply provide. They had to anticipate scarcity. This mental leap is etched into the ground at ancient campsites, where we find the first substantial evidence of storage. They were no longer just consuming what they found each day. They were digging deep pits, lining them with stone or clay, and carefully caching precious surpluses of wild grains, nuts, and dried meat. This was a declaration against the randomness of their new world, a physical manifestation of the thought, what if the hunt fails next season? What if the rains do not come? Alongside these granaries, another tool for taming time began to emerge, the seasonal calendar. By tracking the cycles of the moon and the migration of stars, they could predict the coming of the rains or the spawning of fish. This was not astronomy for its own sake, it was a survival strategy. Knowing that the wild barley would ripen in 2 moons allowed a community to plan its movement and organize its labor. This ability to think in terms of seasons and years, to delay gratification for a greater future reward, was a monumental step in human cognition. It transformed anxiety about the unknown into a manageable plan. How do you build resilience in the face of such deep environmental trauma? The answer lies not just in what they stored, but in who they became together. Overcoming this shared adversity tightened the bonds of community. The stories told around the fire were no longer just tales of the day's hunt. They became epic narratives of survival, of how their ancestors endured the Great Drying and learned to thrive in a new land. These stories passed down a vital legacy, the unshakable belief that they were a people who could overcome. This shared identity, forged in loss, became their greatest psychological resource. It taught them that hardship was not an end, but a challenge to be met with collective ingenuity. The true legacy of the vanished canyons is therefore written in the human spirit, a lesson written across millennia that our most profound struggles can carve the deepest wells of strength. These ghostly canyons left no monuments behind, only whispers in the dirt. Uncovering their story requires a kind of planetary detective work, where scientists read the land like a vast, encrypted text. They drill deep into the earth, pulling up slender cylinders of sediment, layer upon layer of compressed history. In these cores, the tale is written in grains of sand and traces of pollen. A sudden, thick band of coarse gravel speaks of a powerful river's flow, while a fine layer of silt above it tells of the water slowing down, of the canyon beginning to choke. From high above, satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar map subtle depressions and soil variations, revealing the faint, buried contours of a lost world, the skeleton of a forgotten canyon lying just beneath the surface. In the now arid expanses of the Arabian Peninsula, where sand dunes stretch to the horizon, archaeologists have found something astonishing. Scattered across the desert floor are stone tools, carefully crafted hand axes and scrapers, lying in places that are utterly inhospitable today. These artifacts are not where they were left by accident. They are markers of a past abundance, proof that these barren lands were once a lush, canyon-cut landscape where game was plentiful and fresh water flowed. The tools themselves tell a story of adaptation. As the canyons filled and the green retreated, the technology changed. The large, heavy-hand axes suited for butchering big game in a resource-rich valley give way to smaller, more specialized points and blades designed for a harder, more mobile life, for hunting smaller, faster prey in an opening world. The most compelling evidence comes from reading the Earth's layers in sequence, a technique called stratigraphy. At a single dig site, you can see the timeline of collapse and response etched into the wall of an excavation trench. At the very bottom, you might find a layer of river cobbles and the remains of a temporary camp, evidence of people living alongside a thriving watercourse. Directly above that, a thick, uniform layer of fine silt testifies to the canyon's slow suffocation. And then, resting on top of that silt, a new layer of human occupation appears, but this one is different. The stone tools are of a completely new style, and alongside them are the first grinding stones, used to process wild grasses. This is the tangible proof of the pivot, the moment a community, faced with the loss of their river, turned from hunting to a greater reliance on gathered grains. Each of these discoveries, from a single stone flake to a stratified wall of earth, is a data point in humanity's grand story of resilience. They are not just objects, they are answers. They show us that when the familiar world dissolved into sand and silt, our ancestors did not simply vanish. They changed their tools, they changed their diet, and they changed their home, proving that the most enduring human trait is not the ability to resist change, but the profound capacity to evolve with it. The ingenuity of those first water engineers did not vanish with the empires they sustained. Their legacy flowed forward through time, a river of knowledge passed from one civilization to the next. When the Romans built their magnificent aqueducts, they were refining principles of gravity-fed flow, first tested in the dirt canals of Mesopotamia. When Persian engineers constructed their subterranean qanats, those gently sloping tunnels that tapped into mountain aquifers, they were applying an ancient understanding of groundwater that prevented precious liquid from evaporating under a desert sun. This was not lost wisdom, but a cumulative science, a toolkit for survival that was carried along the Silk Road, shared through conquest, and preserved in the libraries of scholars. The very concept of a reservoir, of storing floodwaters for the dry season, is an idea with roots in the deepest human past, born from the trauma of watching a river fail. These early systems were the direct ancestors of the vast networks that quench our modern cities and irrigate our farmlands today. The concrete canals that snake across continents and the complex dams that hold back entire rivers are the technological grandchildren of those first, desperate attempts to control a scarce resource. This historical continuum carries a crucial lesson for our own era. We now face a global water crisis with aquifers depleting and rivers running dry, a situation that echoes the slow death of the ancient canyons. The answer may not lie solely in new technology, but in remembering old wisdom. The ancient engineers knew something we are only now relearning, that you must work with the landscape, not against it. They understood the necessity of capturing rainwater where it falls, of recharging groundwater, and of creating distributed, resilient systems instead of relying on a single, vulnerable source. Their legacy teaches us that the management of water is not just an engineering problem, it is the foundation of civilization itself. To ignore the lessons carved into the earth by our ancestors is to risk repeating their most desperate chapters, a future where we are forced to innovate once more, not out of ambition but out of sheer necessity. Long after the last canyon had faded into a gentle slope, its memory lived on in the human voice. Before libraries or written records, our ancestors preserved the truth of their lost worlds through the most durable medium of all, mythology and oral tradition. These were not mere fables told for amusement. They were living archives meticulously passed from one generation to the next, encoding the trauma of geological change into the very fabric of culture. A story about a great flood sent by angry spirits could be a collective memory of a canyon river silting up and overflowing its banks, drowning the familiar world. A legend of an earth-swallowing chasm that opened overnight might recall the sudden collapse of a cliff face, a terrifying event that became a cautionary tale. The epic journey of a hero across a newly barren land often mirrored the actual migrations forced upon people when their fertile valleys disappeared. These narratives served a profound psychological purpose, transforming chaotic, inexplicable environmental disasters into structured stories with meaning and moral lessons. They provided a framework for understanding the unbearable, offering comfort by suggesting that even the most catastrophic changes were part of a larger, comprehensible order. In Australia, the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories offer a stunning example of this deep time memory. These intricate narratives, describing the actions of ancestral beings who shaped the land, often detail the creation of specific rock formations, waterholes, and mountain ranges. Scientific studies have shown that many of these descriptions align remarkably with geological evidence of coastlines that existed thousands of years ago, before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. The stories remember a landscape that science can now only reconstruct. This was not coincidence, but a sophisticated system of knowledge preservation. By weaving survival lessons into the story of the land itself, these traditions taught each new generation where to find water during a drought, which plants were edible, and how to navigate a transformed world. The endurance of these myths across hundreds of generations highlights a fundamental human need to make sense of profound change through the power of a well-told story. They remind us that our deepest history is not always written on clay tablets, but often lives most vividly in the tales we choose to keep alive. That rich tapestry of life began to fray at the edges. As the Great Canyons softened and vanished, they took entire worlds with them, entire ecosystems that had thrived in their unique microclimates. The specialized plants that clung to moist cliff faces, the unique insects that pollinated them, the small game that fed on those plants, and the large predators that hunted that game, all found their niche collapsing. This was a cascading extinction, a silent unraveling of biodiversity that left the landscape quieter, emptier. For the human communities watching this happen, the most immediate and terrifying loss was the great game animals. The mammoths, the giant bison, the other massive creatures that had been walking larders were disappearing. The old way of life, centered on the hunt, was becoming a gamble with increasingly poor odds. This crisis of scarcity forced one of the most significant pivots in human history, a fundamental renegotiation of our relationship with other species. If they could no longer rely on finding food, they would have to learn to create it. This was the true dawn of domestication. People began to corral the smaller, more manageable animals that remained, like wild goats and sheep. They learned which ones were less aggressive, which produced more milk, and they selectively bred those traits over generations. In the plant world, the same principle applied. Instead of simply gathering every type of wild wheat, they began to consciously save and plant the seeds from the plants with the biggest heads, the ones that held onto their seeds instead of scattering them to the wind. This was the birth of selective breeding, the first application of biological knowledge on a grand scale. The reward was undeniable food security. A herd of goats in a pen was a walking, renewable food source. A field of cultivated wheat was a predictable harvest, but this new security came with a hidden, long-term cost. In the wild, a vast genetic diversity allowed a population of wheat to withstand a new blight or a herd of animals to survive a strange illness. Some individuals would naturally be resistant, but in the human-made version, that safety net was gone. By choosing only the most desirable plants and animals to reproduce, humanity was inadvertently creating a biological monoculture. All the wheat in a field was genetically identical, all the sheep in a flock were closely related. This made them incredibly productive, but also incredibly vulnerable. A single new disease or a shift in the climate could wipe out an entire harvest or a whole herd, a risk our hunter-gatherer ancestors never faced. This ancient dilemma, born from the loss of the canyons, is one we still grapple with today. Our modern agricultural systems, with their vast fields of a single crop, are the direct descendants of that first, desperate decision to control our food supply. The same ingenuity that saved us from starvation also introduced a profound fragility into the foundation of civilization. It is a complex dance, a reminder that every solution we engineer to conquer nature contains the seed of a new challenge, forcing us to constantly balance our need for abundance against the timeless strength of diversity. That slow, planetary sigh of a canyon filling with silt did not just change how people lived, it changed how they lived together. The forced migration from these dying landscapes acted like a great stirring of the human pot, mixing distant groups who had developed their own unique survival strategies in isolation. When these refugees arrived in new river valleys or coastal plains, they did not come empty-handed. They carried with them the hard-won knowledge of their ancestors, a blueprint for a new way of life forged in the crucible of loss. One group might bring a revolutionary design for a fish trap perfected along a vanished river. Another might introduce a new strain of drought-resistant grain, a secret learned from the desperate final years in their old home. This sudden convergence of ideas in fertile new heartlands created a supercharged environment for innovation. Cultural exchange was not always a peaceful process, of course. The arrival of newcomers often sparked conflict over land, water, and resources. But even this friction could force progress, pushing communities to develop more formal systems of defense, negotiation, and eventually diplomacy. Out of this chaotic mingling, a new social order began to crystallize. The old, small-scale leadership of a village elder was no longer sufficient to manage the complexities of a growing, diverse population. From this need, a new kind of power emerged, consolidated in the hands of a few who could organize on a grand scale. We see this in the archaeological record with the sudden appearance of monumental architecture. The ability to command thousands of workers to build a massive temple or a defensive wall is a clear sign of a centralized authority, a leader or a council with the power to coordinate labor and resources on an unprecedented level. This was not about vanity, it was about survival and control. Organizing a vast irrigation network to water the fields of 1,000 families required a single, powerful vision. Marshalling an army to defend against rivals required a chain of command. The very act of managing these shared resources in a crowded, new environment demanded the invention of bureaucracy. Someone had to keep track of who received how much water, who owned which plot of land, and who had paid their taxes in grain. This led to the first written codes of law, designed to mediate disputes and maintain order among people who were no longer bound solely by kinship. The disappearance of a canyon, an event that began with a single grain of sand, could therefore set in motion a domino effect that ended with the rise of a pharaoh, the drafting of a legal code, and the birth of an empire. It reveals the profound interconnectedness of our world, where a change in the earth can ripple through ecology, technology, and society, ultimately forging the very structures of power that would define the ancient world. This cascade of consequences reminds us that civilization is not a static achievement, but a continuous, dynamic response to the ground shifting beneath our feet. Our ancestors understood a truth we are now relearning, that resilience is not a destination but a continuous process of adaptation. Their world of disappearing canyons forced them to diversify or perish, a lesson that echoes powerfully in our era of climate uncertainty. They did not rely on a single source of food or water, instead cultivating a wide variety of plants and harnessing many different animals. This principle of diversification is a powerful antidote to the fragility of our modern systems, where vast monoculture fields are vulnerable to a single pest or a single drought. By returning to polyculture farming, by planting many crop varieties together and integrating livestock, we can build agricultural landscapes that are not only more productive but far more resistant to shock. Their survival was a collective endeavor rooted in the strength of the community. Today, this translates to local food networks, community-supported agriculture, and cooperative resource management, where neighbors share knowledge, seeds, and tools to buffer against global supply chain disruptions. The ancient impulse to store surplus for a lean season finds its modern equivalent in decentralized renewable energy grids and local water harvesting, creating buffers against the unpredictability of a changing climate. The sophisticated irrigation networks of Mesopotamia show us that the most enduring technologies are those that work in harmony with the landscape, not against it. Modern engineers are now reviving these principles, designing green infrastructure that mimics nature, from permeable pavements that allow rainwater to replenish aquifers to restored wetlands that act as natural sponges against floods. The ultimate lesson is that our greatest resource is not a specific technology, but a mindset, one that values foresight, cooperation, and a deep, localized knowledge of place. The same ingenuity that transformed a crisis of emptiness into the dawn of civilization can guide us now, not merely to endure the coming changes, but to build a world that is more adaptable, more connected, and ultimately more human. The quiet rhythm of grinding stone was the sound of survival itself. In the vast upheaval that followed the canyon collapses, it was often women's hands that guided communities through the uncertainty. Their deep, generational knowledge of the land became the bedrock of a new way of life. While men ranged far to hunt the dwindling game, women were the primary botanists and ecologists, possessing an intimate understanding of which wild grasses held the most nourishment, which roots could be stored for winter, and which berries were safe to eat. This was not random gathering, it was a sophisticated science passed from mother to daughter, a living library of plant lore that ensured a community would not starve. The archaeological record offers powerful testament to this role. At ancient campsites, we find the grinding stones, the mortars and pestles, worn smooth from centuries of use. These tools were the engines of the dietary revolution, the technology that transformed hard, wild seeds into digestible flour. This was the foundational act of agriculture, a patient process of selection and cultivation that began with women recognizing and nurturing the most promising plants. Their daily labor, once focused on gathering, slowly shifted to tending, weeding, and protecting. The very first farms were likely small garden plots cultivated by women just outside their dwellings, a direct result of their unrivaled expertise in the plant world. Beyond securing food, women were the weavers of social fabric. They raised the next generation in a transformed world, teaching children the new survival skills and the old stories that gave them identity. As keepers of oral traditions and healing practices, they provided the cultural continuity that held a community together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Their knowledge of medicinal herbs offered the only remedy for sickness and injury, and their role in mediating disputes and fostering cooperation was essential for maintaining group harmony in times of extreme stress. This historical reality carries a profound lesson for our own time. The survival of our ancestors was not the achievement of a single type of hero, but a collective effort that thrived on diverse perspectives. The insights women brought to resource management, community building, and long-term planning were not secondary, they were vital. Their legacy reminds us that true resilience is always inclusive, drawing on the full spectrum of human knowledge to navigate an unpredictable world. This cascade of innovation did not remain in isolated pockets. The desperate need to master new environments sent shockwaves through every facet of human life, creating a chain reaction of invention. A sharper axe, first crafted to clear land for primitive farms, represented more than just a better tool. Its creation required a deeper understanding of how to select the toughest stones, how to heat-treat them for durability, and how to haft them securely to a handle. This knowledge of material science, born from the struggle to eat, did not stay in the fields. It spilled over into the construction of permanent homes, allowing for stronger foundations and better roofing. It refined the craft of boat building, enabling the creation of more seaworthy vessels for trade and exploration. The initial problem of survival was solving challenges its creators had never envisioned. Meanwhile, the daunting task of navigating vast, unfamiliar territories pushed the human mind to look upward, to travel safely and predict the seasons for planting in strange lands. People began to map the heavens with newfound precision. They tracked the cycles of the sun and moon, noting the predictable wanderings of certain stars. This celestial knowledge, a direct response to geographical displacement, became the world's first global positioning system. It enabled the creation of the first rough maps and reliable seasonal calendars, which in turn secured longer trade routes and more dependable harvests. Each solution fed into the next in a powerful feedback loop. Better navigation protected trade networks, which distributed new materials, which inspired better tools, which increased agricultural yields, which supported larger populations, which then demanded even more innovation. This pattern reveals a fundamental truth about human progress. Our greatest leaps forward are rarely single, isolated events. They are cascades where a single necessity, like the loss of a canyon, forces one adaptation that inevitably unlocks a dozen others. The relentless pressure to survive became the engine of civilization itself, proving that our most enduring technologies are often born from our most profound constraints. That quiet rhythm of grinding stone was more than just a sound of survival. It was the beginning of a new relationship with the world, one that carried a profound and lasting responsibility. The disappearance of the ancient canyons was a force of nature, but the human response set a precedent for how we would shape our environment from that point forward. This history forces us to confront a difficult ethical question. Where does adaptation end and acceleration begin? While our ancestors were victims of a changing planet, their own actions, like the overhunting of megafauna or the clearing of land for early settlements, likely intensified the ecological upheaval. They were not malicious, they were simply trying to live, yet their struggle left a mark on the earth. This legacy places a weighty obligation on our shoulders today. We now possess an unprecedented understanding of how our industries, our agriculture, and our very way of life alter the global climate and erase natural landscapes. This knowledge comes with a duty to act, not out of fear, but out of a deep-seated responsibility to the generations who will inherit the world we leave behind. The central ethical challenge we face is a constant balancing act. How do we meet the very real needs of a growing global population for housing, food, and energy, while also preserving the intricate natural systems that make life possible? The answer may lie in looking back, not to a primitive past, but to the wisdom of indigenous practices that have endured for millennia. These cultures did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as a part of its intricate web. Their traditional knowledge emphasizes harmony, taking only what is needed and giving back to ensure the land's continued health. This is not a romantic ideal, but a practical, time-tested model for sustainability. The story of the lost canyons is a stark lesson in long-term consequences. A decision made to hunt a few more mammoths during a time of scarcity, repeated across generations, could contribute to an irreversible extinction. A community clearing trees for a new village might not foresee how it will change local rain patterns for centuries to come. Our modern dilemmas with deforestation, carbon emissions, and water pollution are simply the same story playing out on a global scale. Embracing an ethical perspective is not about halting progress, but about guiding it with foresight and wisdom. It means valuing the silent work of a forest in cleaning our air and regulating our climate, and factoring that into our economic decisions. It means investing in renewable energy not just because it is cleaner, but because it is a promise to the future. The past shows us that humanity is incredibly resilient, capable of reinventing itself in the face of planetary shifts. Our greatest test now is to channel that same ingenuity not just to adapt to change, but to become thoughtful, responsible stewards of the world that has forced us to evolve for so long. The silent echoes of our own lost landscapes now reach across the void of space. On Mars, the desolate plains are scarred by immense, dry canyons, unmistakable evidence of ancient rivers that once thundered across the red planet. These are not mere curiosities, they are a mirror held up to our own world's deep past, a geological Rosetta Stone for deciphering the history of water and climate on other worlds. By understanding precisely how Earth's own canyons were sculpted, filled, and ultimately erased, planetary scientists can reverse engineer the dramatic story of Mars. They can calculate how much water was needed to carve the Valles Marineris, a canyon system so vast it would stretch across the entire United States, and model how long it might have flowed before the planet grew cold and dry. This is more than just academic detective work. It is a practical guide for the greatest search of all, the hunt for extraterrestrial life. If we know that life on Earth clung to the sheltered, resource-rich environments of fading canyons, then we know exactly where to look for its fossilized remains on Mars. The smooth, sediment-filled floors of Martian valleys become the most promising sites for rovers to drill, the very places where microbial life, if it ever existed, would have made its last stand. The resilience our ancestors demonstrated in the face of environmental collapse provides a blueprint for what we might someday find, or even become, on another world. The technologies we are developing for surviving on Mars, from extracting water from mineral soils to building habitats from regolith, are direct descendants of those ancient human innovations. They are answers to the same fundamental challenges of scarcity and shelter, scaled for an alien environment. This cross-planetary perspective teaches a humbling and thrilling lesson. The same forces that shaped human destiny on Earth are universal. The collapse of a canyon, the struggle for water, the drive to adapt, these are not just Earth stories, they are cosmic patterns. In seeking the ghosts of lost canyons on Mars, we are not only searching for alien life, we are preparing to write the next chapter of our own survival, guided by the oldest lessons our planet has to offer. The disappearance of these ancient canyons was never an ending. It was a profound turning point, a geological ultimatum that forced our ancestors to author entirely new chapters in the human story. From the first seed deliberately planted in the silt of a lost riverbed to the sprawling cities that rose from managed water, each leap was a response to that emptiness. The resilience we so often celebrate was not born in times of plenty, but forged in the crucible of scarcity. This long view of our past offers a powerful lens for our present. The environmental challenges we face today, as daunting as they are, belong to this same legacy of planetary change. They are not a signal of our end, but a call to our most defining trait, the capacity to adapt, to cooperate, and to innovate our way forward. The silent canyons teach us that crisis and creativity are two sides of the same coin. Let this journey inspire you to look at our world's current struggles not with despair, but with the knowledge that we are the descendants of survivors who turned loss into legacy. What ancient wisdom could guide our modern approach to resilience? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If these mysteries of our past resonate with you, subscribe for more explorations into the forces that shape our world. Carry this lesson forward that even in the face of profound change, the human story is always one of new